The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as hundreds of tourists gathered behind the iron gates. Among them stood Sarah Martinez, a 28-year-old teacher from Phoenix, Arizona, clutching her camera with trembling hands. This was her first trip to London, a dream vacation she had saved for 3 years to afford. The red double-decker buses rumbled past on the nearby street, and the iconic sounds of the city filled the air. But Sarah's attention was completely focused on the magnificent palace before her. She had arrived early, determined to capture the perfect photograph of the famous Queen's Guard during the changing of the guard ceremony. The tourists pressed against the black railings, smartphones and cameras ready, creating a sea of excited faces from every corner of the world. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, elderly couples held hands while pointing at the palace windows, and tour guides spoke in multiple languages, their colorful umbrellas held high above the crowd. The Queen's Guard stood motionless at their posts, their iconic red tunics and towering black bearskin hats making them look like something from a fairy tale. These were not mere costume performers but highly trained soldiers from elite regiments, each having served in combat zones around the world. Their stoic expressions and perfect posture commanded respect. Yet many tourists seemed to forget these were real military personnel with serious duties to perform. Sarah adjusted her camera settings, trying to find the perfect angle. The morning light was beautiful, creating a golden glow on the palace facade. She stepped slightly to her left, then to her right, searching for that magazine-worthy shot that would make her friends back home envious. Other tourists shuffled around her, everyone jockeying for the best position along the crowded barrier. As she focused through her viewfinder, Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision. One of the guards, a tall man with broad shoulders beneath his pristine red uniform, stood perfectly still at his post near the palace entrance. His white gloves gripped his rifle with military precision, and his face remained expressionless beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. This was exactly the shot she wanted. Without thinking about palace protocol or the clearly posted signs warning tourists about proper behavior, Sarah ducked under the security rope that separated the public viewing area from the restricted zone. Her excitement overrode her common sense as she stepped onto the pristine gravel path that led directly to the palace entrance. The crunch of stones beneath her sneakers seemed unnaturally loud in the morning air. She raised her camera, completely absorbed in getting the perfect close-up photograph. The guard looked magnificent through her lens, a living statue representing centuries of British tradition and military excellence. Sarah took several quick shots, the camera's shutter clicking rapidly as she tried to capture different angles. She was so focused on her photography that she failed to notice the sudden tension that rippled through the crowd behind her. Murmurs began spreading among the tourists. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people started pointing in her direction. A few visitors who understood the seriousness of royal protocol looked genuinely concerned, while others pulled out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold. The tour guides stopped their presentations midst, their experienced eyes recognizing the potential for an international incident. The guard Sarah was photographing remained motionless for several more seconds, but his trained eyes had immediately assessed the situation. These soldiers were experts at dealing with security breaches, having undergone rigorous training to handle everything from harmless tourist mistakes to genuine threats. Every movement in their vicinity was catalogued and evaluated within seconds. Sarah stepped even closer, completely unaware of the growing tension around her. She was now less than 10 feet from the guard, well within the restricted security perimeter that protected one of the world's most important buildings. Her camera continued clicking as she tried to capture the intricate details of his uniform, the polished buttons, the perfectly maintained rifle, and the weathered leather of his boots. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. A Japanese tourist lowered his camera and whispered something urgent to his wife in their native language. A British family looked genuinely embarrassed by the American tourist's behavior, the father shaking his head while muttering about respect for tradition. Children asked their parents what was happening, sensing the adults' growing anxiety but not understanding the cultural significance of the moment. Security personnel positioned around the palace perimeter began moving with subtle efficiency, though not immediately visible to the casual observer. These plainclothes officers had been watching the situation develop from the moment Sarah crossed the barrier. Radio communications crackled quietly through earpieces as positions were adjusted, and backup was quietly summoned. The morning breeze caught Sarah's hair as she knelt down to get a low-angle shot, her camera now pointing upward at the towering guard. She was completely in her element, thinking about how impressed her photography club back home would be with these professional quality images. The palace made such a stunning backdrop, and the guard's uniform was even more impressive up close than she had imagined. Then, without any warning, the situation exploded into chaos. The guard's voice erupted like thunder across the courtyard, his military training producing a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his chest. "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." The words crashed over the crowd like a physical force, causing Sarah to stumble backward in complete shock. Her camera nearly slipped from her trembling fingers as the reality of her situation hit her like a cold wave. The crowd collectively gasped. hundreds of people suddenly stepping back from the barriers as if the god's voice had pushed them physically backward. Children began crying, startled by the sudden explosion of sound in what had been a peaceful morning scene. Parents scrambled to comfort their frightened kids while simultaneously trying to see what would happen next. Sarah's face turned bright red with embarrassment and fear. She had never been shouted at with such authority and power in her entire life. The god's voice carried the weight of centuries of military tradition, the commanding presence that had once rallied troops on battlefields around the world. Her hands shook as she tried to process what had just happened. Her dream vacation suddenly turning into her worst nightmare. But what happened next would be talked about for years to come, shared across social media platforms around the world, and remembered by every person in that crowd as one of the most unexpected moments they had ever witnessed. The god's next action would challenge everything the tourists thought they knew about these stoic protectors of the crown, revealing a humanity beneath a ceremonial uniform that nobody could have predicted. The morning that had started so perfectly for Sarah Martinez was about to take a turn that would change not only her life but also her understanding of duty, compassion, and the complex human beings who serve as the face of royal tradition. The crowd held their breath, cameras forgotten, as they prepared to witness something that defied all expectations about the legendary Queen's Guard. The echo of the god's thunderous command still rang in the air when something extraordinary happened. As Sarah stumbled backward, her foot caught on an uneven stone in the gravel path. Time seemed to slow as she lost her balance completely, her arms flailing as she tried to regain control. Her expensive camera flew from her hands, spinning through the morning air like a bird with broken wings. The crowd watched in horror as Sarah fell hard onto the sharp gravel, her knee hitting the ground with a sickening crack that could be heard even from behind the barriers. She cried out in pain, a sound that cut through the tension like a knife. Blood immediately began seeping through her torn jeans, and her camera lay several feet away, its lens cracked and body dented from the impact on the unforgiving stones. What happened next defied every expectation, every story, every legend about the emotionless Queen's Guard. The same god who had just delivered that bone-chilling command immediately broke from his rigid position. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and knelt beside Sarah, his military bearing transforming in an instant from intimidating authority to genuine concern. The massive bearskin hat that had made him look so imposing now seemed almost gentle as he leaned down to assess her injuries. "Are you hurt badly, miss?" His voice, which moments before had commanded fear and respect, now carried warmth and genuine worry. The contrast was so stark that several tourists actually gasped out loud. Children stopped crying and stared in amazement. Even the most experienced tour guides stood speechless, having never witnessed anything like this in decades of bringing visitors to the palace. Sarah looked up at him through tears of pain and embarrassment, completely stunned by this unexpected kindness. The face beneath the bearskin hat belonged to a man in his early 30s, with kind brown eyes and a concerned expression that seemed completely at odds with the stern military figure from moments before. His name tag, barely visible on his red tunic, read Guardsman Thompson. "I think I hurt my knee pretty badly," Sarah managed to say through gritted teeth, trying not to cry from both physical pain and overwhelming embarrassment. The gravel had torn through her jeans and scraped her palms raw when she tried to break her fall. Her dream photograph was forgotten, replaced by the nightmare of causing an international incident at one of the world's most famous landmarks. Guardsman Thompson gently helped Sarah into a sitting position, his white-gloved hands steady and reassuring. "Let's have a look at that knee, shall we?" His accent was distinctly British, but his tone was that of someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. He carefully examined the torn fabric and the bleeding wound beneath, his training evident in how professionally he assessed the injury. The crowd pressed closer to the barriers, phones now recording not for entertainment but out of genuine amazement at what they were witnessing. A Swiss family lowered their cameras entirely, the father explaining to his young daughter in German that they were seeing something very special. An elderly British couple held hands tighter, the woman wiping tears from her eyes as she watched the scene unfold. "It's not too deep, but it needs proper cleaning and bandaging," Thompson said, his voice maintaining that perfect balance of authority and compassion. "Can you stand with help?" He positioned himself to offer support, completely abandoning his ceremonial post to care for the injured tourist. Other guards maintained their positions, but their eyes followed the scene with obvious approval. This was not breaking protocol in their minds. This was upholding something far more important than ceremony. The senior guard near the main entrance gave an almost imperceptible nod, a signal that Thompson had his full support in prioritizing human compassion over rigid tradition. Sarah gripped Thompson's sturdy arm and slowly rose to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her injured knee. The crowd spontaneously began applauding, a sound that grew from a few scattered claps to thunderous appreciation that echoed off the palace walls. Tourists from dozens of countries were witnessing something that challenged every stereotype they had heard about the cold. "Emotionless guards, my camera," Sarah said weakly, looking at the damaged equipment lying on the gravel. It represented not just an expensive loss but the destruction of her hopes for perfect vacation. "Memories." Thompson followed her gaze and carefully retrieved the broken camera. examining it with the same attention he had given to her injury. "I'm afraid it's taken quite a knock," he said gently, "but the memory card might still be intact. The important thing is that you're not seriously hurt." A palace security officer approached, speaking quietly into his radio. The situation had been assessed and contained, but protocol required certain procedures to be followed when tourists entered restricted areas. However, seeing Thompson's compassionate handling of the situation, the security team's approach became more about assistance than enforcement. "We'll need to get you some medical attention for that knee," the security officer said kindly. "There's a first aid station just inside the visitor center. Can you walk that far with assistance?" Sarah nodded, still overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. She had come to London expecting to take photographs of stoic, untouchable guards, but instead found herself being cared for by one with extraordinary humanity. The pain in her knee was nothing compared to the warmth spreading through her chest at this unexpected kindness. Thompson walked beside her, offering his arm for support as they moved slowly toward the visitor center. His ceremonial uniform, designed to intimidate and impress, somehow looked different now. The red tunic and gleaming buttons seemed less like a costume, and more like the uniform of someone who truly served others. "I'm so sorry," Sarah said as they walked. "I know I shouldn't have crossed that rope. I just wanted the perfect picture, and I got carried away." "We understand the excitement," Thompson replied with a gentle smile. "The palace has that effect on people, but these protocols exist for everyone's safety, including yours. That gravel path can be treacherous, as you've discovered." The crowd continued watching, many now filming this unprecedented display of humanity from a Queen's Guard. Social media would soon explode with videos and photos of the moment. But for now, the tourists simply stood in respectful appreciation of what they were witnessing. A young boy in the crowd called out, "Thank you, guard," in heavily accented English, and soon other voices joined in. "Bravo," shouted someone in French. "Wonderful," added a voice with an Australian accent. The appreciation was universal, transcending language barriers. As they reached the visitor center, Thompson helped Sarah settle into a chair where a trained medic began cleaning and bandaging her wounded knee. The guard stood nearby, ensuring she was comfortable before he would return to his duties. "Will you get in trouble for helping me?" Sarah asked, suddenly worried that her mistake might cause problems for this kind man. Thompson's smile was reassuring. "Miss, helping people in distress is exactly what we're trained to do, whether it's protecting the crown or assisting an injured tourist. Service is service." The medic finished bandaging Sarah's knee and declared that while painful, the injury wasn't serious. She would need to keep it clean and rest it for a few days, but there would be no lasting damage. As the immediate crisis passed, Sarah realized she was about to witness something even more remarkable than Thompson's initial kindness. As the medic finished treating Sarah's knee, Guardsman Thompson was preparing to return to his post when something unexpected happened that would make this day even more extraordinary. From within the crowd, a commotion began near the back barriers. An elderly man was pushing through the tourists, his face urgent and determined. "Excuse me, pardon me," the man called out in a distinctly American accent, his voice carrying authority despite his advanced age. He was well dressed in an expensive suit, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being heard. Several tourists stepped aside, recognizing something important in his manner. The palace security officers noticed the disturbance and moved to intercept, but the elderly man raised his hand in a gesture that commanded attention. "Please, I need to speak with that guardsman immediately. It's extremely important." Thompson heard the commotion and turned, his training making him alert to any potential security concern. The elderly man was now at the front barrier, his eyes locked on Thompson with an intensity that made everyone around him fall silent. "Guardsman Thompson," the man called out, reading the name tag from a distance. "James Thompson from Manchester, 3rd Battalion Grenadier Guards." Thompson's eyes widened in surprise. Very few civilians would know such specific military details, and fewer still would use them so precisely. He approached the barrier cautiously, his professional instincts engaged. "Yes, sir, that's correct," Thompson replied formally. "How may I help you?" The elderly man's eyes filled with tears, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "Son, my name is Colonel Robert Harrison, United States Marine Corps, retired. 52 years ago, your father saved my life in Northern Ireland." The crowd went completely silent. Even the traffic noise from the street seemed to fade as everyone strained to hear this unexpected revelation. Sarah, still seated with her bandaged knee, felt goosebumps rise on her arms. This was no ordinary encounter. Thompson's military composure faltered for just a moment, emotions crossing his face as he processed what he had just heard. "My father, sir, my father was Sergeant William Thompson, but he died when I was 12. I don't understand." Colonel Harrison fumbled in his jacket pocket and pulled out an old, worn photograph. Even from several feet away, Sarah could see it showed two young soldiers in military fatigues, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling despite the obvious tension of their surroundings. "Belfast, 1972, Harrison continued, his voice stronger now. "Your father and I were part of a joint operation. IRA bomb went off in a building we were clearing. I was trapped under debris, unconscious and bleeding. William Thompson crawled back into that burning building 3 times to pull me and 2 other soldiers to safety. He saved 4 lives that day, including mine. Thompson stepped closer to the barrier, his eyes fixed on the photograph. The crowd pressed forward, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Parents lifted children to see better, and phones continued recording what was becoming a moment of historical significance. I tried to find him after the war, Harrison continued. Wrote letters, made calls, but we lost touch. I never got to properly thank him. Then last week I was visiting London with my granddaughter, and we came here for the changing of the guard. When I saw your name tag and heard you speak, something about your voice reminded me of William. I did some research, made some calls to old military contacts. Harrison pulled out a manila folder from under his arm. I found out about William Thompson from Manchester, how he continued serving with distinction, how he earned the Military Cross for bravery. I learned he had a son who followed in his footsteps, joining the Grenadier Guards. When I saw you today, helping that young lady with such compassion and professionalism, I knew you had to be William's boy. Thompson's eyes were now bright with unshed tears. Sarah watched, transfixed, as this incredible story unfolded before the amazed crowd. The other guards maintained their positions, but she could see they too were deeply moved by what they were hearing. Sir Thompson said quietly, "My father never talked much about his service. He always said he just did his job." That's exactly what he would have said. Harrison laughed through his tears. William was the most humble hero I ever met. He saved my life, and I went on to have a 40-year career in the Marines, got married, had children and grandchildren. None of that would have happened without your father's courage. The colonel reached into his folder and pulled out an official-looking document. "James, I've spent 50 years trying to find a way to honor your father properly. I've been working with the British Embassy and the Ministry of Defense. This is a posthumous commendation recognizing William Thompson's extraordinary service and sacrifice in Northern Ireland." Thompson's military training couldn't suppress his emotions any longer. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he accepted the document through the barrier. His hands, so steady when helping Sarah, now trembled as he read his father's name on the official commendation. The crowd began applauding again, but this time it was different. This wasn't just appreciation for a kind gesture. This was recognition of a family legacy of service and sacrifice. People wiped tears from their eyes, moved by this unexpected reunion between the son of a hero and the man whose life had been saved decades earlier. Sarah found herself crying too, overwhelmed by the beauty of this moment. She had come to London seeking the perfect photograph, but instead she was witnessing something far more precious than any picture could capture. Her injured knee was forgotten in the face of this extraordinary human connection. "There's more," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to establish a scholarship in your father's name, the William Thompson Memorial Scholarship for Children of Service Members. I've been successful in business, and this is how I want to honor the man who gave me the chance to live my life." Thompson was speechless, overwhelmed by this unexpected tribute to his father's memory. The other guards, despite their training to remain stoic, were visibly moved. Even the palace security officers stood quietly, recognizing the profound significance of this moment. A young girl in the crowd called out, "Your daddy was a hero." Her innocent words seemed to perfectly capture what everyone was feeling. "He was indeed," Harrison replied, looking at the child with a warm smile. "And his son is carrying on that tradition of service and compassion." As if the day couldn't become more remarkable, Harrison had one final surprise. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "James, this belonged to your father. I've carried it for 52 years, waiting for the right time to return it." Thompson carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a simple military compass, brass and worn from years of use. Engraved on the back were the words, "W. Thompson, always find your way home." "He dropped this when he was pulling me from that building," Harrison explained. "I picked it up afterward, intending to return it, but we shipped out before I had the chance. I've kept it safe all these years, hoping someday I could give it back to his family." The moment was so profound that even the sounds of London seemed to pause in respect. The weight of his father's compass in Thompson's hands seemed to anchor him to a moment that felt almost too extraordinary to be real. As he turned the worn brass instrument over in his palm, reading the engraved words that his father had looked at countless times during his service, something magical began happening in the crowd around them. A middle-aged woman stepped forward from the gathered tourists, her German accent clear as she spoke in careful English. "Excuse me, I am sorry to interrupt, but I could not help hearing this beautiful story." She was well, with kind eyes behind fashionable glasses, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to speaking publicly. "My name is Dr. Ingrid Müller, and I work for a television production company in Berlin. We create documentaries about remarkable human stories." She looked between Thompson and Colonel Harrison with obvious excitement. "Would you consider allowing us to document this reunion properly? This is exactly the kind of story the world needs to hear." Before anyone could respond, a young man with a professional camera pushed through the crowd. "I'm Marcus Chen, freelance photographer for Reuters," he called out breathlessly. I was here covering the changing of the guard when I saw what happened. Sir, he addressed Thompson directly, with your permission, these photographs could help tell your father's story to the world. Thompson looked overwhelmed, still clutching his father's compass. The day that had started as routine ceremonial duty had transformed into something beyond his wildest imagination. Colonel Harrison placed a reassuring hand on the barrier between them. James, your father never sought recognition for what he did, the colonel said gently, but maybe it's time his story was told. Maybe other people need to hear about ordinary heroes who do extraordinary things. Sarah, still seated with her bandaged knee, found herself speaking up. I'm a teacher, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed crowd. I work with children every day, and they need to know that heroes aren't just in movies or video games. They're real people, like your father, like you. Her words seemed to resonate with parents in the crowd. A father lifted his young son higher on his shoulders, whispering explanations about what they were witnessing. An elderly British couple nodded approvingly, the woman dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Thompson looked around at the faces surrounding him, all waiting for his response. These weren't just tourists anymore. They had become witnesses to something profound. Among them, he noticed a teenage boy in a wheelchair, pushed by what appeared to be his mother. The boy was wearing a t-shirt that read military brat and proud, and his eyes were fixed on Thompson with obvious admiration. What would you want me to do? Thompson asked Colonel Harrison quietly. I think, the colonel replied with a smile, your father would want his story to inspire others to serve, to help, to show compassion just like you did today. You honored his memory by helping that young lady, by showing that duty and kindness aren't opposites but partners. The crowd murmured approval, and Dr. Mueller stepped forward again. If I may suggest, we could arrange for a proper interview, perhaps at a location that would honor both your father's memory and your current service. The story could help fund the scholarship Colonel Harrison mentioned. Suddenly, from behind the palace gates, another figure appeared. A senior officer in dress uniform approached, his bearing unmistakably that of high rank. The guards immediately stiffened to attention, recognizing their commanding officer, Guardsman Thompson. The officer called out formally, but his tone carried warmth rather than reproach. I'm Colonel Patricia Davies, your commanding officer. I've been watching this entire exchange from the palace windows. Thompson snapped to attention despite still holding his father's compass, but Colonel Davies gestured for him to remain at ease. Guardsman, your conduct today has been exemplary. Your compassion for the injured tourist and your dignified handling of this extraordinary situation reflect the very best traditions of the Guards. She turned to address Colonel Harrison through the barrier. Colonel Harrison, on behalf of Her Majesty's Guards and the British Army, I want to thank you for honoring the memory of Sergeant William Thompson. Your dedication to finding his family after all these years speaks to the bonds that unite military personnel across all nations. The crowd applauded again, but Colonel Davies wasn't finished. Guardsman Thompson, you're granted special leave for the remainder of the day to properly honor this moment with Colonel Harrison. The Ministry of Defense has been contacted, and there will be a formal ceremony later this week to properly recognize your father's service. Thompson's eyes widened in surprise. Ma'am, that's very generous, but I don't want to leave my post. Your post today, Guardsman, is to represent the best of what the Guards stand for. You've already done that magnificently by helping Miss ... She looked toward Sarah Martinez. Sarah supplied quickly, still amazed to find herself part of this incredible story. Miss Martinez, Colonel Davies continued, and by graciously receiving this tribute to your father, the Guard will continue without you for a few hours while you attend to this important family matter. Colonel Harrison was already making arrangements through the barrier with palace security to meet Thompson properly. Dr. Mueller was coordinating with Marcus Chen about capturing the reunion on film. Other tourists were respectfully maintaining their distance while still clearly hoping to witness whatever happened next, but it was the teenage boy in the wheelchair who provided the next unexpected moment. His mother pushed him forward slightly, and he called out in a clear, strong voice, Guardsman Thompson, my dad served in Afghanistan. He always said the best soldiers are the ones who remember their human first. Thompson walked over to the barrier near the boy and knelt down to his eye level. What's your name, son? Danny Morrison. So, my dad is Sergeant Tom Morrison, Royal Engineers. He's deployed right now, but he always tells me stories about soldiers like your father. Your father is serving his country with honor, Thompson replied, and you're honoring him by being here, learning about service and sacrifice. Danny reached into his backpack and pulled out a small British flag. Would you take this, sir, for your father's memory? My dad sent it to me from his deployment, but I think your father should have it. The gesture was so pure, so heartfelt, that even the most composed adults in the crowd began tearing up again. Thompson accepted the flag with obvious emotion, carefully folding it and placing it next to his father's compass. Danny, your father would be very proud of you today. This flag will hold a place of honor in my home. As Thompson prepared to leave his post for this extraordinary family reunion, Sarah realized she needed to do something. Despite her injured knee, she stood up carefully and approached the barrier. Guardsman Thompson, she called out, I know my camera is broken, but before you go, could I ask you something? Thompson turned to her with that same kind expression he had shown when helping her earlier. "Of course, Miss Martinez, when I get home to Arizona, I'm going to tell my students about today, about your father's heroism, about your kindness, about how one person's compassion can change everything. Would it be all right if I told them your story?" Thompson smiled, the same humble expression his father might have worn. "Miss Martinez, if it helps your students understand that being a hero isn't about being fearless, it's about doing what's right even when you're afraid, then please tell them whatever you think might help." As the crowd prepared to witness the formal reunion between Thompson and Colonel Harrison, none of them could have predicted that this remarkable day still had surprises left to unfold. An hour later, Thompson found himself in an elegant conference room within the Palace Visitor Center, still wearing his ceremonial red tunic but now seated across from Colonel Harrison at a polished mahogany table. The room was quiet except for the gentle ticking of an antique clock and the distant sounds of London traffic. Dr. Mueller had set up her camera discreetly in the corner, while Marcus Chen positioned himself to capture this historic conversation between two generations connected by heroism. Sarah sat nearby, her injured knee properly elevated on a cushioned chair. Despite being the catalyst for this entire extraordinary day, she felt almost invisible as she watched these two men bridge a 52-year gap with their words. Palace staff had provided tea and biscuits, creating an atmosphere of civilized comfort that seemed perfectly British. "Tell me about growing up without him," Colonel Harrison said gently, his weathered hands wrapped around his teacup. "I need to understand what my survival cost your family." Thompson was quiet for a moment, his father's compass resting on the table between them like a bridge across time. "Mum always said Dad was the bravest man she knew, but she never talked about what happened in Northern Ireland. She just said he died serving his country when I was 12, and that he would have been proud of the man I was becoming." The Colonel's eyes grew distant as memories from decades past seemed to surface. "Your father talked about you constantly during our deployment. He carried pictures of you as a baby, then as a toddler. He was so proud when you took your first steps, said his first word." William would sit by the radio every night, hoping for news from home. "I barely remember him," Thompson admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Just fragments, really. The smell of his aftershave, the sound of his laugh, the way he would lift me up and swing me around when he came home on leave. After he died, it felt like trying to hold on to smoke." Harrison reached into his folder again and pulled out another photograph, this one showing a much younger version of Thompson's father holding a baby. "He gave me this picture to keep safe during a particularly dangerous mission. I said if anything happened to him, I should make sure his boy knew his daddy loved him more than life itself." Thompson stared at the photograph, seeing himself as an infant in his father's strong arms. For the first time in decades, the abstract concept of his father's love became tangible, real, preserved in this moment captured so long ago. "He used to say," Harrison continued, "that every life he saved in the service was practice for coming home to save yours from skinned knees and broken toys and all the troubles a boy could get." Sarah watched this exchange with tears in her eyes, understanding now why her stumble in the palace courtyard had triggered such immediate compassion from Thompson. His instinct to help someone in distress wasn't just military training, it was a legacy passed down from father to son across the years. Dr. Mueller adjusted her camera angle slightly, recognizing that she was documenting something far more significant than a simple reunion. This was a masterclass in how heroism ripples through generations, how one man's courage in 1972 had shaped the character of the soldier sitting in this room today. Colonel Harrison Thompson said carefully, "May I ask you something personal? What happened after my father saved you? What did you do with the life he gave back to you?" The elderly colonel smiled, and for a moment his weathered features seemed to glow with pride. "I went home to marry my fiancée, and we got married 6 months later. We had 4 children, 8 grandchildren, and just last month, our first great-grandchild. I built a successful construction business, employed hundreds of people over the years, served on the city council, coached Little League Baseball for 20 seasons. He paused, pulling out his wallet to show current photographs of a large, happy family gathered around a Christmas tree. "Every birthday party, every wedding, every graduation, every moment of joy in our family exists because your father crawled back into that burning building to pull me out." Thompson studied the photographs of strangers who were connected to him through his father's courage, children playing in yards, teenagers in graduation caps, a young woman in a wedding dress, an infant sleeping peacefully in someone's arms. "But more than that," Harrison continued, "I spent 30 years in the Marines after Belfast, and I trained hundreds of young soldiers. I taught them what your father taught me about courage, about duty, about never leaving someone behind. Some of those soldiers went on to save lives themselves, to serve their communities, to raise families with the values I learned from William Thompson." Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she realized the true scope of what they were discussing. This wasn't just about one man saving another in 1972. This was about how a single act of heroism had echoed through decades, touching hundreds of lives in ways both seen and unseen. Marcus Chen moved quietly around the table, capturing the emotion in Thompson's face as he processed this information. The photographer had covered wars, natural disasters, and political upheaval, but he had never documented anything quite like this intimate moment where past and present merged through human connection. "There's something else," Harrison said, reaching once more into his seemingly endless folder. "After I tracked down your service record, I did some research on you as well. James, did you know that in your 8 years with the Guards, you've been commended for helping civilians 7 different times?" Thompson looked surprised. "Sir, that's just part of the job. Tourists get confused, lost, sometimes hurt. It's not anything special. A lost child reunited with parents in Hyde Park, an elderly man having a heart attack near Westminster, a woman being harassed by strangers on the Underground, a house fire where you helped evacuate residents before the fire brigade arrived." Harrison read from an official document. "Son, you've been living your father's legacy every single day without even realizing it." The room fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled over everyone present. Sarah understood now that her tumble in the courtyard had been just the latest in a long line of moments where Thompson had instinctively chosen compassion over protocol, humanity over regulation. "Your commanding officer was right," Harrison continued. "You represent the very best of what the Guards stand for, not because you follow orders, but because you understand that real duty means serving others, just like your father did." Dr. Mueller leaned forward slightly, recognizing that they had reached a crucial moment in the story. "James, how does it feel to learn that your father's heroism has been living on through you all these years?" Thompson was quiet for a long moment, turning his father's compass over in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I always wondered if I was honoring his memory properly. I knew so little about his service, about what kind of soldier he was. Now I understand that he wasn't just my father. He was someone who changed the course of history by choosing to act when others might have hesitated." He looked directly at Colonel Harrison. "Sir, thank you for carrying his memory all these years. Thank you for showing me that the man I barely remember was someone worth remembering." As the afternoon sun streamed through the conference room windows, casting long shadows across the table, none of them could have predicted that the most surprising revelation of this extraordinary day was still to come. As the conversation in the conference room continued, there was a gentle knock on the door. Colonel Davies entered, followed by an unexpected figure that made everyone in the room stand in respectful surprise. An elderly woman with silver hair and bright blue eyes walked in, supported by a walking stick but moving with obvious determination. "James," Colonel Davies said formally, "I'd like you to meet someone very special. This is Mrs. Dorothy Williams, former head of the Belfast Red Cross Unit, 1972. Thompson's eyes widened as he recognized the significance, but it was Colonel Harrison who gasped audibly, Dorothy Williams. My God, it's really you." The elderly woman smiled, her eyes twinkling with recognition despite the decades that had passed. "Hello, Robert. I wondered if I might see you again someday. When the palace contacted the Red Cross about today's events, and I heard the names William Thompson and Robert Harrison, I knew I had to come." Sarah watched in amazement as yet another piece of this incredible puzzle fell into place. Dr. Mueller quickly adjusted her camera to capture this unexpected addition to an already remarkable story. Mrs. Williams moved slowly toward the table, her cane tapping softly on the polished floor. "James, dear boy, you look so much like your father, it takes my breath away. I was there that day in Belfast. You know, I treated your father's injuries after he pulled Robert and the others from that building." Thompson helped her into a chair, his military courtesy automatic but his expression showing complete bewilderment at how this day continued to unfold beyond anything he could have imagined. "Mrs. Williams," Harrison said, his voice filled with emotion, "I never got to thank you properly either. You saved my life just as much as William did, treating my injuries, keeping me stable until proper medical help arrived." The elderly woman waved dismissively. "Nonsense, Robert. Your William Thompson was the hero that day. But I need to tell you both something that I've kept to myself for 52 years. She reached into her small handbag and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax that had long since cracked. "William asked me to hold on to this before the final medical transport. He was conscious, alert, but he seemed to know something the rest of us didn't." Thompson stared at the envelope, which bore his name written in handwriting he didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. Mrs. Williams placed it gently in his hands. "He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I should find you when you were grown, when you were old enough to understand what kind of man your father was. I've been tracking your military career for years, James, waiting for the right moment." With trembling hands, Thompson carefully opened the envelope that had waited more than 5 decades to be read. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in his father's careful handwriting. As he began to read, his voice broke, and Sarah found herself crying again at the raw emotion in the room. "My dear James," Thompson read aloud, "if you're reading this, then Mrs. Williams has kept her promise and I am no longer with you. I want you to know that every dangerous mission I undertake, every risk I take to help others, I do thinking of you and your mother, hoping to make the world safer for the family I love more than my own life." He paused, wiping tears from his eyes before continuing. "Today I helped save some good men. soldiers who have families waiting for them just like you and Mom are waiting for me. I pray I'll see you again, but if I don't, I need you to know that being your father has been the greatest honor of my life. Be kind to others, son. To help when you can. Stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. That is the Thompson way. The room was completely silent except for the gentle sound of people crying. Even Marcus Chen had lowered his camera, too moved by the moment to continue photographing. Thompson's hands shook as he read the final lines. I'm leaving you my compass, the one that helped me find my way through dangerous places. But remember, James, the most important compass is the one in your heart that always points toward helping others. Follow that compass, and you'll never be lost. I love you, son. Make me proud. Your devoted father, William. Colonel Harrison was openly weeping now, understanding that his survival had come at the cost of this beautiful relationship between father and son. Mrs. Williams reached across the table and took Thompson's free hand in her weathered fingers. Your father died 2 days later from complications of his injuries, she said softly. But James, I want you to know that he spent those final hours talking about you, about the man he hoped you would become. He would be so incredibly proud of the soldier you've become, of the compassion you showed today. Sarah spoke up from her corner, her voice soft but clear. He would be proud because you are exactly the man he hoped you would be. Today, when I fell and hurt my knee, your first instinct wasn't to maintain protocol or protect yourself from trouble. Your first instinct was to help someone who needed help. Dr. Mueller, who had been documenting this entire extraordinary day, stepped forward slightly. James, this story needs to be shared with the world. Not just the heroism of your father, or the dedication of Colonel Harrison in finding you, but the simple truth that compassion and duty can exist together beautifully. Thompson looked around the room at these people who had become connected through his father's legacy. Colonel Harrison, who had spent 52 years carrying gratitude in a compass. Mrs. Williams, who had honored a dying soldier's final request for over 5 decades. Sarah, whose accident had triggered this amazing chain of events. Dr. Mueller and Marcus Chen, who would help share this story with people who needed to hear it. My father wrote that the most important compass is the one in your heart, Thompson said finally. Today I learned that compass was working perfectly, even when I didn't know it was there. Colonel Harrison stood and extended his hand across the table. James, your father saved my life so I could live to see this day, to meet the remarkable man his son became. I consider that the greatest gift I could ever receive. As they shook hands, Mrs. Williams smiled with deep satisfaction. William, wherever you are, your boy turned out just fine. 3 months later, the William Thompson Memorial Scholarship was established, funded not only by Colonel Harrison's generous donation but by contributions from around the world. After Dr. Mueller's documentary aired, Sarah returned to her classroom in Arizona with a story that changed how her students thought about heroism and service. Danny Morrison, the young man in the wheelchair, received the scholarship's first award to attend university and study engineering like his father. Thompson continued his duties with the Queen's Guard, but now he carried his father's compass on every shift. Tourists still approached him for photographs, and occasionally someone would step too close to his post. When that happened, his response remained the same firm military command to stand back. But if someone needed help, if someone fell or was in distress, Guardsman James Thompson would always remember the most important lesson his father had taught him. That true strength lies not in standing rigid, but in knowing when to bend down and help someone up. The crowd that witnessed that extraordinary morning at Buckingham Palace dispersed 2 countries around the world, carrying with them a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. They had come seeking a glimpse of royal tradition, but instead they discovered something far more valuable. Proof that heroes are real, that kindness matters, and that the best human qualities can echo through generations, touching lives in ways we might never fully understand. Sarah's broken camera was never repaired, but she realized she had captured something far more precious than any photograph. A memory of the day she learned that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with an unexpected fall and end with a discovery that we are all connected by invisible threads of compassion, duty, and love.